There is a stretch of water in the Caribbean Sea, somewhere between the green shoulders of Hispaniola and the low, sun-bleached shores of the Bahamas, where the wind moves in a way that sailors have always remembered. It comes in warm and steady from the east, bending the surface of the water into long, slow rolls that catch the light in the late afternoon and turn it the color of hammered copper. Ships have always loved this wind, and one ship, above all others, learned to use it better than anything else that had ever been built. It was small, remarkably, almost insultingly small, by the standards of the great maritime powers of the early 18th century. It carried one mast, sometimes two. It sat low in the water, close to the surface, close enough that a man standing at the rail could drag his fingers through the sea if he chose. It was not built for war, not in the way that men in London or Madrid or Amsterdam understood war at sea. It was not built for empire, or for the movement of treasure across oceans, or for the grand set-piece battles that naval officers spent their careers dreaming about. It was built to move, and in that singular, almost deceptively simple purpose, the sloop would change everything. To understand what the sloop meant to the golden age of piracy, you first have to understand what the ocean looked like before it arrived, and what kind of vessels ruled it. By the late 1600s, the great European powers had spent generations constructing fleets of almost unimaginable ambition. The ships of the line, those towering multi-decked men of war that carried 60, 80, sometimes 100 guns stacked in rows along their sides, were the most complex machines the world had ever produced. They were floating fortresses, floating cities almost. A first-rate ship of the line required a crew of 800 men, months of provisioning, and years of skilled labor to build. Their hulls were thick with seasoned oak. Their rigging ran in miles of rope, tended by specialists who spent their entire lives learning the language of line and sail. These ships were powerful beyond reckoning. They were also, by any practical measure, slow. They were heavy, deep-drafted, and reluctant. Not in any deficient way, but simply because their purpose was to hold a battle line, to absorb punishment and return it, to dominate the open ocean through sheer, accumulated force. They were not built for shallow water. They were not built for the narrow channels and hidden coves and labyrinthine island passages of the Caribbean. And they were certainly not built for speed. Beneath them, in the hierarchy of naval vessels, sat frigates, and beneath frigates sat smaller craft, ketches, brigantines, snows, and schooners, each serving its own purpose in the vast machinery of maritime empire. Merchant vessels moved the wealth of the Americas across the Atlantic in deep-bellied hulls: sugar, tobacco, logwood, silver, and slaves, all packed into holds that sat heavy and slow in the water, protected sometimes by a handful of guns, more often by nothing more than the hope that no one unfriendly was watching. The ocean, in other words, was organized, but organized around size, around weight, around the assumption that power moved in straight lines, and that the biggest ship in any encounter would determine its outcome. The sloop did not accept that assumption. Developed gradually through the maritime cultures of the Caribbean and the American colonies, the sloop was, at its core, a working vessel. Fishermen used it. Traders used it. The shallow water merchants of Bermuda, Jamaica, and the Chesapeake Bay refined it over decades into something lean and responsive, a hull form that sat light on the water and answered the helm with a quickness that larger vessels simply could not match. Its defining characteristic was not its armament, which was modest. It was not its size, which was by design unremarkable. Its defining characteristic was its relationship with the wind. A well-built sloop could point into the breeze at an angle that made square-rigged ships look like they were standing still. It could run with the wind at speeds that left heavier vessels behind within an hour. It could slip into water that would ground a frigate, disappear into a cove that appeared on no chart, and reappear somewhere unexpected, miles away, before anyone had properly registered that it had gone. The pirates of the Golden Age understood this. They understood it the way a craftsman understands a perfect tool, immediately, instinctively, and with something close to gratitude. They took the sloop, and they made it their own. And for roughly 30 years, across a span of open water stretching from the coast of West Africa to the far edges of the American colonies, that small, low, fast, and utterly unassuming ship would become the most feared sight on the ocean. This is its story. How the sloop was built, what made it different, and why pirates could not look away. There is a particular kind of knowledge that does not come from books. It comes from water, from the feel of a hull moving beneath your feet when the wind shifts by a single degree, from the sound a sail makes when it is trimmed correctly. That quiet, almost imperceptible tightening of canvas that a good sailor recognizes before he can explain why. From years of crossing the same stretches of shallow, unpredictable sea and learning, slowly, and sometimes painfully, what a boat needs to survive them. The men who built the sloop possessed this knowledge in abundance. They were not naval architects in the formal European sense. They carried no titles. They answered to no admiralty board, submitted no plans for royal approval, and received no commissions from kings. They were Bermudian shipwrights, working in small yards on a small island, building small boats for the practical demands of small-scale trade. And in their quiet, unheralded work, they produced something that the greatest naval establishments in the world had never quite managed to arrive at. A vessel that was not merely fast, but intelligently fast. Fast in the right places, at the right moments, in the precise conditions where it mattered most. To understand what they built, you have to begin with the hull. A ship's hull is, in its most essential function, a compromise. Every decision a shipwright makes involves trading one quality for another. You want carrying capacity. You build the hull wide and deep, and you sacrifice speed. You want speed. You narrow the hull, reduce the draft, and you sacrifice cargo space and stability in heavy weather. You want to survive a broadside from a man of war. You build thick, heavy walls of oak, and you sacrifice almost everything else. The great warships of the age were built around the compromise of power. The great merchant vessels were built around the compromise of volume. The sloop was built around something more elusive and, in its way, more valuable than either. It was built around the compromise of options. The typical sloop of the late 17th and early 18th centuries measured somewhere between 40 and 70 feet along the waterline, though examples ran both shorter and longer, depending on their purpose and their builder. Its beam, the width across the widest point of the hull, was relatively narrow in proportion to its length, which gave it a clean entry into the water and reduced the resistance that wider vessels had to push through with every wave. Its draft, the depth of the hull below the waterline, was shallow, sometimes remarkably so, allowing it to move through water that would stop a larger vessel dead. But the hull shape alone does not explain the sloop's character. For that, you have to look up. The sloop's rig, the arrangement of its masts, booms, and sails, was its true genius, and it was a genius that emerged not from theory, but from the accumulated wisdom of Caribbean sailors who had spent their working lives reading the winds of that particular sea. The dominant rig of the age for large vessels was the square rig, sails hung from horizontal yards crossing the mast at right angles, catching the wind from behind and driving the ship forward with tremendous force when the breeze was favorable. Square-rigged ships were magnificent running before the wind. They were significantly less magnificent doing anything else. Sailing close to the wind, angling toward the direction the wind was coming from, was a laborious, inefficient business for a square rigger, demanding constant adjustment, delivering modest results, and always leaving a wide angle of approach from which the vessel could not sail at all. Sailors called this dead zone the no-go zone. and for square-rigged ships it was wide enough to matter enormously. The sloop carried a fore and aft rig. Its primary sail, the mainsail, was set along the line of the keel rather than across it, hung from a long boom extending behind the mast, and a long gaff, angling upward from its front face. This arrangement meant that the sail could be adjusted through a wide arc, swinging from one side of the vessel to the other as the wind demanded, always working with the breeze rather than simply receiving it. A fore and aft rigged vessel could sail considerably closer to the wind than any square rigger of comparable size. It could tack, change direction by turning its bow through the wind, with a speed and economy that left square-rigged captains watching in something between admiration and frustration. In the Caribbean, where the trade winds blow with consistency, but where islands create local effects, shifting channels, and unexpected calms, this ability to point high into the wind and maneuver with precision was not merely an advantage. It was, on countless occasions, the difference between escape and capture, between freedom and the gallows. The pirates understood this geometry instinctively. They had sailed these waters. They knew where the wind went reliable and where it went strange. They knew which channels could be threaded under full sail and which demanded the kind of careful, responsive helming that only a quick vessel could manage. When they looked at a sloop, they did not see a modest coastal trader. They saw a set of possibilities that no other vessel in the Caribbean could match. There were other qualities, practical and unglamorous, that recommended the sloop to men living outside the law. Maintenance, for one. A first-rate ship of the line required a naval dockyard to keep it operational. Facilities that covered acres, employed thousands of specialized workers, and existed only at the pleasure of a government with the wealth to sustain them. Even smaller naval vessels required regular access to proper harbors, to chandlers and riggers and caulkers and coopers, to the whole vast support network that kept a commissioned ship in fighting condition. A sloop could be maintained on a beach. The process, called careening, involved deliberately heeling the vessel onto its side on a shallow, sheltered shore, ideally a sandy one, in a cove where no one was likely to appear uninvited, and exposing the bottom of the hull to air and the labor of the crew. The men would scrape away the accumulation of weed and barnacles that built up on any wooden hull, and that, if left unchecked, could reduce a fast vessel to a slow one within months. They would check the caulking between the hull planks, driving in fresh oakum where the sea had worked it loose. They would apply a protective coating, often a mixture of tallow, sulfur, and tar, and then right the vessel, re-step any rigging that had been disturbed, and sail away. This could be accomplished by a competent crew in a matter of days. No dock, no crane, no admiralty permission required. Just a quiet stretch of coastline, a committed group of men, and the specific, irreplaceable knowledge of how to keep a wooden ship alive. For pirates, whose entire existence depended on their ability to disappear, to operate in the spaces between official attention, in the unnamed coves and unclaimed islands that dotted the Caribbean like a scattered handful of stones. This capacity was invaluable. They could vanish not just over the horizon but into the landscape itself, hauled up on some forgotten shore, invisible to the naval patrols that moved along the established sea lanes, looking for exactly them. The sloop's armament deserves consideration as well, because it reflects something important about how pirates thought about their work. A well-equipped pirate sloop might carry between 4 and 14 guns, typically lighter pieces than those mounted on naval vessels, 4-pounders or 6-pounders, rather than the massive 18 or 24-pound guns of a ship of the line. These were not weapons designed to destroy an enemy vessel. They were weapons designed to discourage one, to fire a warning shot across a merchant's bow, to convince a captain, already weighing the lives of his crew against the value of his cargo, that cooperation was the more sensible choice. Pirates were, at heart, businessmen of a particularly ruthless variety. Violence was expensive. It damaged the prize, wounded the crew, consumed ammunition, and attracted the kind of official attention that made subsequent operations more difficult. The sloop's reputation, properly cultivated, often did more work than its guns ever needed to. A vessel known to be fast enough to run down anything in the Caribbean, carrying a crew desperate and experienced enough to fight without hesitation, made for a compelling argument in favor of simply heaving to and allowing yourself to be boarded. The sloop was the vessel that made this argument most effectively, because the sloop was the vessel that could back it up. A merchant captain who decided to run from a naval frigate might have some reasonable hope of success if the weather was right and his hull was clean. A merchant captain who decided to run from a well-handled pirate sloop had almost no hope at all. The sloop would close the distance with an ease that felt almost casual. The pirates at their stations, the hull driving through the water at speeds that the lumbering merchant simply could not match. Until the options ran out, and the flag came down, and another prize was added to the tally. By the opening decades of the 18th century, roughly 1700 to 1720, the period historians would eventually identify as the heart of the golden age of piracy. The sloop had become the defining vessel of the outlaw maritime world. Blackbeard used one before he graduated to larger prizes. Bartholomew Roberts began his career aboard one. Benjamin Hornigold commanded a fleet of them out of Nassau. Charles Vane terrorized the Bahamas in one, slipping away from a Royal Navy warship in 1718 with a brazenness that became the talk of every tavern from Port Royal to Charlestown. Their names would be remembered. Their deeds would pass into legend. Their flags, those careful, deliberate messages stitched in black cloth and run up the mast at the critical moment, would become among the most recognizable symbols in the entire history of seafaring. But beneath all of it, beneath every raid and every escape and every act of audacity that the Golden Age produced, there was a hull in the water, low, fast, unremarkable to the uninformed eye, waiting for the wind to shift, waiting for the moment to move. It is easy, at a distance of 300 years, to romanticize the pirate. The popular imagination has had a long time to work on the image, and it has worked on it thoroughly. What we are left with is a figure that bears only a passing resemblance to the historical reality, swaggering and free, answering to no one, sailing into the sunset with a hold full of gold, and a crew of loyal companions who have chosen adventure over the suffocating ordinariness of ordinary life. It is a compelling image. It is, in almost every meaningful respect, a false one. The men who sailed under the black flag during the golden age of piracy were not, in the main, men who had chosen adventure. They were men who had run out of alternatives, and to understand what drove them to the sea, and to the particular kind of sea life that ended, more often than not, at the end of a rope, you have to spend a little time with the world that produced them, because that world was harder and stranger and more brutal than most people today are asked to reckon with. And it made hard, strange, brutal men, who, in their hardness, found in the sloop the one instrument perfectly suited to everything they needed to do. The late 17th century was a period of almost continuous war in Europe, and war in Europe in that era was not a distant abstraction. It was a tide that moved through ordinary life with a force that rearranged everything it touched. The 9 Years' War ended in 1697. The War of the Spanish Succession began in 71 and ground on until 1714. Between them and around them, smaller conflicts flared and subsided across the Atlantic world, like embers that never quite went out. Each of these wars required navies, and navies required men, and the methods used to obtain those men were not always, or even often, voluntary. The press gang was as familiar a feature of port life in England as the public house or the parish church. A man could walk out of a tavern in Bristol or Portsmouth on a Tuesday evening and find himself, by Wednesday morning, rated able seaman aboard a ship of His Majesty's Navy, with no more say in the matter than the rope that had been used to persuade him. He would serve for the duration, however long that proved to be, under conditions that ranged from merely unpleasant to genuinely lethal, eating food that would have been turned away at a workhouse, sleeping in spaces too small to stand upright, and submitting to a discipline enforced by the lash and administered by officers whose authority was essentially absolute. When the wars ended, something predictable happened. The navies shrank. Tens of thousands of sailors, trained to no other trade, found themselves turned out onto the docks of a dozen port cities with a few months' back pay, sometimes less, and the understanding that their services were no longer required. The merchant fleets, swollen during wartime to supply the armies, contracted as well. There were simply not enough berths for the number of men who needed them. These men did not vanish. They gathered in the port towns, in the boarding houses and the taverns, and the corners of the market where casual work was advertised, and frequently did not materialize. They understood the sea. They understood ships. They understood the specific grammar of maritime life, the hierarchy, the labor, the danger, the camaraderie. And they found themselves unable to practice any of it in any legitimate capacity. Some of them made a different choice. The Bahamas, in the first decade of the 18th century, was a place of spectacular disorder. Nassau, the principal settlement on New Providence Island, was nominally a British colony, but was in practice governed by no one in any serious sense. The appointed governors were either absent, ineffectual, or quietly complicit in the activities they were nominally charged with suppressing. The harbor was good. The surrounding waters were labyrinthine, a maze of islands, cays, shoals, and channels that a stranger could spend a week navigating and still not fully understand. And the weather was, for most of the year, magnificent. Pirates arrived and found it suited them. Then more pirates arrived. By roughly 1705, Nassau had become what historians would later call a pirate republic, an informal settlement of several hundred men living outside the law, operating according to their own customs, electing their own officers, and raiding the trade routes of the Caribbean and the Atlantic with a freedom and an efficiency that caused considerable distress in London, Madrid, and the counting houses of every merchant company operating in the Western Atlantic. The men who populated this world came from everywhere, from the pressed crews of naval ships, as described, from the legitimate merchant marine, where the conditions were marginally better, but not always by much, from the privateers, those state-sanctioned pirates who had spent the war years raiding enemy shipping under a letter of marque and found, when peace arrived, that no one had thought to explain to them what they were supposed to do next, from the sugar plantations of Barbados and Jamaica, where the labor that did not belong to enslaved Africans was performed by indentured servants whose terms of service were, in their own way, scarcely more voluntary, and from the logwood camps of the Bay of Honduras, where English and Scottish and Irish cutters worked in brutal conditions, knee-deep in mangrove swamps, felling the trees whose heartwood produced the red and purple dyes that European textile markets consumed with an appetite that showed no sign of diminishing. These men, the baymen as they were called, were experienced boatmen, comfortable in shallow water, accustomed to hardship, and possessed of a relationship with legal authority that was, at best, skeptical. What they shared, across all these different origins, was an experience of the sea as a place of labor rather than romance. They knew how ships worked because they had worked ships, in the cold and the heat and the dark, for the financial benefit of people who were not them. They understood maritime hierarchy because they had lived at the bottom of it, and many of them had reached a point where the calculus of risk had shifted in a way that made the alternatives to piracy seem, if not less dangerous, then at least less certain in their misery. The code that governed pirate ships, and there was a code, more formal and more carefully considered than most people expect, reflected this background in ways that are both illuminating and, To a modern reader, occasionally surprising, pirates voted. They voted on their destination, on their choice of target, on whether to accept a prize or scuttle it. The captain of a pirate vessel was elected by the crew, and he held his authority in battle but surrendered it, in almost all other circumstances, to the collective will of the men he commanded. This was not democracy in any philosophical sense. It was pragmatism. Men who had spent their lives subject to arbitrary authority, who had been pressed, flogged, cheated of wages, and discarded when they were no longer useful, devised for themselves a system that distributed power in a way that felt, if not just, then at least less unjust than anything they had previously experienced. The articles, the written agreements that defined the terms of service aboard a pirate vessel, specified in detail how plunder would be divided. The captain took a share and a half to double the ordinary crewman's portion, a modest premium by the standards of legitimate maritime employment. The quartermaster, who handled the day-to-day administration of the ship and acted as a check on the captain's authority in non-combat situations, received a similar premium. The rest was divided equally. A man who lost an eye in the service of the company received a fixed compensation from the common stock. A man who lost a hand received more. The scale was agreed upon before sailing and posted for all to read or have read to them. This was, in the context of the early 18th century, a remarkable set of arrangements. It was not utopia. Pirate ships could be violent, chaotic places, and the democracy they practiced had limits that became visible whenever racial or social hierarchies reasserted themselves in the pressure of a crisis. But for many of the men who signed the articles, it represented more security and more agency than anything legitimate employment had ever offered them. They protected these arrangements with everything they had, and the sloop was what they had. Consider what the sloop meant to a crew of 50 or 60 men living this life. It meant, first, that they could not easily be caught. A naval frigate dispatched to suppress piracy in the Caribbean was crewed by men who did not particularly want to be there, maintained by a supply chain that stretched 3,000 miles back to England, and constrained to operate within a set of orders that had been written by people who had never seen the waters in question. The pirate crew, aboard their clean-hulled, lightly laden sloop, could simply leave. They could be over the horizon before the frigate had finished coming about. They could be in shallow water, behind a reef, banished into the island geography of the Bahamas or the Windwards or the Leeward Islands, while the naval vessel sat in open water and contemplated the injustice of the situation. It meant that they could choose their engagements. This was perhaps the most profound military advantage the sloop conferred. A conventional naval engagement involved two vessels closing with each other in open water and battering one another until one side could no longer continue. Pirates had no interest in this kind of fighting. They were not at war in any conventional sense. They were running a commercial operation of a violent kind. And the ideal outcome of any commercial operation is profit achieved at the lowest possible cost. The sloop allowed them to approach a target from an advantageous angle, to run it down before it could reach port or hail a passing warship, and to present the captain with a situation so clearly hopeless that the decision to surrender became, if not easy, then at least straightforward. It meant, finally, that they could survive the failure of any single venture. A pirate crew that lost their prize in a storm, or misjudged a target and found themselves outgunned, or ran aground on a chart error, could careen their sloop on the nearest suitable shore, make their repairs, and try again. They carried their means of survival with them. They were not dependent on a harbor or a government or a patron. They were dependent on each other and on the vessel beneath their feet. These were men who had learned, through long and often painful experience, that the world extended very little grace to those without power. In the sloop, they had found a form of power that the world had not thought to account for. Not the power of weight or armament or official authority, the power of speed, the power of disappearance, the power of being, at any given moment, somewhere other than where you were expected to be. For a few extraordinary decades, it would prove sufficient. Next, the Golden Age begins. The routes they sailed, the prizes they took, and the names that made the Atlantic world afraid. Segment 4. The Golden Age. The routes they sailed, the prizes they took, and the names that made the Atlantic world afraid. In the summer of 1715, a hurricane moved through the Straits of Florida with a patience and a thoroughness that the Spanish Empire would spend the next decade trying to recover from. It struck on the last day of July. 11 ships of the Spanish treasure fleet, the famous floater that carried the accumulated wealth of the Americas back to Seville each year, were somewhere between Havana and the coast of North America when the storm found them. 10 of the 11 were driven onto the shallow reefs and sandbars of the Florida coast and wrecked. The 11th, a French vessel sailing in convoy, managed to claw its way north and survive. Something in the order of 1,000 Spanish sailors drowned in the space of a single night, and somewhere between 14 and 30 million pesos in silver, gold, jewelry, and contraband went to the bottom of the sea in waters shallow enough that a man standing on the beach could see the wreck sites at low tide. The Spanish mounted immediate salvage operations. They sent divers and guards and official delegations from Havana. They posted soldiers along the beach to prevent unauthorized recovery of the king's silver. They were, given the scale of the disaster and the remoteness of the location, only partially successful. Word traveled, as word always did in the Caribbean, faster than any official communication. Within months, vessels from Jamaica and the Bahamas were working the wreck sites, pulling up coins and ingots that the Spanish divers had missed or hadn't yet reached. Some of these were legitimate salvors, operating under unofficial arrangements. Some were not, and among those who were not, among the men drawn to the Florida coast by the prospect of silver lying in 3 fathoms of warm water, requiring nothing more than a capable diver and the willingness to conduct operations that the Spanish government would not have sanctioned. There were several figures whose names would go on to define the golden age of piracy in the public imagination for the next 300 years. The age had not quite begun, but it was about to. To speak of the Golden Age as though it were a single coherent event is, strictly speaking, an oversimplification. It was, more accurately, a concentration, a period of roughly 25 years, from approximately 1700 to 1725, during which piracy in the Atlantic world reached a level of organization, audacity, and geographic reach that it had never achieved before, and would never achieve again. It was fed by the specific conditions described in the previous segment. The flood of unemployed sailors after the War of the Spanish Succession, the disorder of the Bahamas, the extraordinary richness of the Atlantic trade routes, and it was shaped, more than any other single factor, by the sloop. The trade routes themselves are worth examining because they explain with great clarity why the Caribbean and the adjacent Atlantic became the center of this world. The Atlantic economy of the early 18th century ran on a series of interlocking circuits that moved goods, people, and money in patterns that had been developing for 200 years. Sugar from Barbados, Jamaica, and the French islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe moved north and east, to Britain, to France, to the refineries of Amsterdam, to the distilleries of New England that turned Caribbean molasses into rum and shipped it back south and east to West Africa, where it purchased enslaved people who were shipped west across the Middle Passage to work the plantations that produced the sugar. Silver from the mines of Mexico and Peru moved north through Havana and east across the Atlantic to Seville, or was smuggled through a dozen informal channels to Jamaica and the English colonies, where it oiled the commercial machinery of an economy that never had quite enough hard currency to function properly. Tobacco from Virginia, rice from Carolina, logwood from the Bay of Honduras, beaver pelts from the fur trade of the northern colonies, indigo, ginger, cotton, cocoa. The Atlantic of the early 18th century was a conveyor belt of extraordinary productivity, and virtually all of it moved by ship, and virtually all of those ships, on the routes that mattered most to pirates, were slower than a well-handled sloop. The geography favored the predator. The Windward Passage, the channel between Cuba and Hispaniola, through which vessels moving from the Caribbean to the open Atlantic were almost obligatorily funneled, was a natural choke point that pirates learned to work with an efficiency that approached the industrial. The Florida Straits, for vessels moving north from Havana, the waters off the Carolina coast, where the Gulf Stream pushed northbound traffic close together in a corridor that a fast vessel could patrol for weeks. The approaches to major ports, Charlestown in South Carolina, Port Royal in Jamaica, the roads off Nassau, where merchant vessels slowed and converged and made themselves available. These were the hunting grounds, and across them, in their low, fast sloops, moved the men whose names the Atlantic world was learning to fear. Benjamin Hornigold arrived in Nassau sometime around 1713 or 1714, and quickly established himself as the dominant figure in the emerging pirate community there. He was not, by most accounts, a man of exceptional cruelty or theatrical ambition. He was something more useful than that. He was competent. He understood the mechanics of maritime raiding with a practical clarity that made him effective in a world where effectiveness was the only currency that reliably held its value. Hornigold operated primarily in sloops. He understood their advantages as well as any man alive, and he used them to build a small but coherent operation out of Nassau that, at its peak, was disrupting trade across a wide arc of the Caribbean and the Bahamas. His most significant contribution to the Golden Age, however, was not anything he did himself. It was a man he mentored and then released into the world with a set of skills and an appetite for notoriety that Hornigold himself had never possessed. His name was Edward Thatch. History would remember him as Blackbeard. It is difficult even now to separate Blackbeard, the man, from Blackbeard the performance. He was both, and he understood the relationship between them with an acuity that would not have been out of place in a later, more self-conscious age. The physical appearance was the foundation. The dense black beard braided and tied with ribbons, the slow-burning fuses tucked beneath the brim of his hat, so that his face in battle was wreathed in coils of sulphurous smoke. The eyes that contemporary accounts describe as extraordinary in their effect, without always being able to specify quite what that effect was. He was a large man and a physically intimidating one, and he cultivated both qualities deliberately because he understood that a reputation for terrifying, unpredictable violence was, in practical terms, a force multiplier. The more feared he became, the less actual fighting he was required to do. And fighting, as noted, was expensive. Blackbeard began his independent career in a sloop. He operated out of Nassau initially, then ranged more widely. The Caribbean, the Windward Passage, the Carolina coast, taking prizes with a speed and consistency that built his name in the maritime gossip networks of every port in the Atlantic world. When he captured the French slaver La Concorde in late 1717 and converted her into a 40-gun warship, he renamed Queen Anne's Revenge. It was a mark of his ambition expanding to match his reputation. He had outgrown the sloop. He was thinking in larger terms. A flagship, a fleet, a pirate empire organized around his personal authority in a way that Nassau's informal community had never been. It was, arguably, the beginning of his undoing. But before that end arrived, there was the blockade of Charlestown. In May of 1718, Blackbeard anchored his fleet, Queen Anne's Revenge, and several sloops operating as consorts, in the approaches to Charlestown Harbor in South Carolina, and simply stopped the traffic. For approximately a week, no vessel entered or left one of the most important ports in British North America without Blackbeard's permission. He ransomed his prisoners, demanded a chest of medical supplies from the colonial government, and conducted the entire operation with a composure that suggested he found the whole affair only mildly interesting. The colonial authorities were furious. The merchant community was terrified. The British government, receiving the news several weeks later across the Atlantic, began to take the problem of Caribbean piracy with a seriousness it had previously found easy to defer. The blockade of Charlestown was not accomplished by Queen Anne's revenge alone. The sloops in Blackbeard's fleet were the instruments of control, fast enough to intercept anything that tried to slip past, shallow enough to work the channels, flexible enough to respond as conditions changed. Even at his most ambitious, even commanding a vessel of 40 guns, Blackbeard never entirely abandoned the tactical logic of the sloop. 4,000 miles to the east, on the coast of West Africa, another man was building a career that would eventually dwarf Blackbeard's in terms of sheer geographic reach and raw tonnage of prizes taken. His name was Bartholomew Roberts, and he is, by any objective measure, the most successful pirate of the Golden Age. Roberts came to piracy reluctantly, or so the accounts suggest. He was serving as mate aboard a slave ship called the Princess when it was taken by the pirate Howell Davis in June of 1719 off the coast of present-day Ghana. Davis was himself an able and ambitious operator, commanding a sloop called the Buck, and he recognized in Roberts a quality of seamanship and navigation that was immediately useful. When Davis was killed in an ambush in the Gulf of Guinea a few weeks later, the crew elected Roberts captain. He had been a pirate for approximately 6 weeks. What followed over the next 3 years was a campaign of maritime raiding that covered the Atlantic from Newfoundland to West Africa, from the Caribbean to Brazil, and that accumulated somewhere between 400 and 500 prizes. The precise count has never been definitively established, which is itself a measure of the scale. Roberts took ships of every description. He raided the Portuguese treasure fleet off the coast of Brazil. He terrorized the fishing fleets of Newfoundland so thoroughly that the colonial governor wrote despairing letters to London, describing the destruction of a season's catch and the flight of fishermen from waters they had worked for generations. He blockaded the harbor of Trepassey in Newfoundland with a single sloop, his own, and held 22 merchant vessels in place, while his crew methodically stripped them of everything useful. He was fastidious in his personal habits, religious in his observances, and absolutely pitiless in his professional conduct. He drew up articles for his crew that prohibited gambling aboard ship, and required all lights to be extinguished by 8 in the evening. He was, in the words of one historian who studied him closely, the most unlikely pirate imaginable, and the most effective one the Golden Age produced. Roberts flew multiple flags over the course of his career, but the one most associated with him showed a figure. Himself, it was understood, standing with 1 foot on a skull labeled ABH, and 1 foot on a skull labeled AMH, a Barbadian's head, a Martinican's head. The governors of those islands had been particularly aggressive in their pursuit of him, and Roberts was communicating in the visual language of the black flag, a message that required no translation. He was not afraid of them. He was, in fact, looking for them. These were the names that the Atlantic world knew. But the Golden Age was not made only by famous men. It was made by hundreds of crews aboard dozens of vessels, most of whose names have been lost, operating in the spaces between the famous incidents, taking small prizes, working familiar routes, living the daily reality of a life that was violent and cramped and cold at night even in the tropics, and shot through with moments of tedium that no romantic account has ever found a way to make interesting. These men, the anonymous majority of the Golden Age, depended on the sloop in the most immediate and practical way. They had no Queen Anne's revenge to fall back on, no fleet of consorts, no reputation fearsome enough to cause a merchant captain to heave to without being asked. They had their hull and their sail and their crew and their knowledge of the water, and they had to make that sufficient. Mostly, they did. The trade routes continued to be disrupted. The insurance rates in London climbed steadily as the losses mounted. Merchants petitioned Parliament. Governors wrote their despairing letters. And out on the water, in the channels and the passages and the open stretches of the Atlantic, where the wind blew warm and reliable from the east, the sloops kept moving. Low, fast, patient in the way that only a vessel perfectly suited to its purpose can be patient, waiting for the sail on the horizon that would resolve, as the distance closed, into something worth pursuing. Next, the Empire strikes back. The decision in London, the men sent to enforce it, and the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. Segment 5. The Reckoning. The Empire strikes back, the world closes in, and what the sloop left behind. There is a particular kind of patience that belongs to large institutions. It is not the patience of wisdom exactly, nor the patience of restraint. It is the patience of mass, the slow, almost geological patience of a thing so large and so complex that it cannot respond quickly even when it wishes to, and that compensates for this slowness with a memory that does not fade, and a capacity for eventual, overwhelming force that smaller and faster things cannot ultimately outlast. The British Empire, in the second decade of the 18th century, was precisely this kind of institution. It had watched the golden age of piracy develop for years with a frustration that gradually deepened into something colder and more purposeful. The merchant community had grown loud and specific in its grievances. The insurance syndicates of London were paying out claims at a rate that made Atlantic trade an increasingly unattractive proposition for the investors whose capital kept the whole system moving. And the political embarrassment of the situation, the richest maritime empire in the world, unable to protect its own shipping lanes, had become impossible to sustain. The decision, when it finally came, was characteristically British in its combination of pragmatism and ruthlessness. It came in the form of a document, and a man, and a set of instructions that would, within the space of a few years, effectively dismantle the world the pirates had built. The Act for the More Effectual Suppression of Piracy, passed by the British Parliament in 1717, made two significant changes to the legal framework governing maritime crime. The first was procedural. It allowed piracy trials to be conducted in admiralty courts anywhere in the empire, rather than requiring accused pirates to be transported to England for trial. This sounds administrative. Its practical effect was to make conviction and execution dramatically faster and more geographically convenient. A pirate captured in the Caribbean no longer had to survive the crossing to London before facing a judge. He could be tried, sentenced, and hanged within weeks of his capture, in a port where the merchants he had robbed could attend the proceedings, and the sailors of the harbor could watch the body swinging in the gibbet as a reminder of the wages of a particular kind of ambition. The second change was a pardon, or rather, the offer of one. Any pirate who surrendered to a representative of the Crown before September of 1718 would be granted a full pardon for all acts of piracy committed before January of that year. It was a calculated offer, designed to fracture the community of Nassau, to separate those who were tired and frightened and genuinely wanted a way out from those who were committed, for whatever reason, to continuing. Divide, absorb, and then isolate whoever remained. The man sent to deliver this offer and to enforce what followed it was Woodes Rogers. Rogers was, by any measure, an extraordinary choice for an extraordinary assignment. He had circumnavigated the globe between 1708 and 1711 as a privateer captain, surviving storms, scurvy, Spanish warships, and the specific organizational challenges of keeping two vessels and their crews functional for 3 years in waters that offered very little in the way of support. He had rescued Alexander Selkirk from his island off the coast of Chile, the marooned sailor whose story would eventually inspire Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. He had returned to England with a prize worth somewhere in the region of £800,000, and had immediately become entangled in the legal disputes over its distribution that occupied him expensively for years afterward. He was practical. He was unsentimental. He had spent enough time at sea in enough difficult circumstances to understand exactly what he was dealing with in Nassau, and he did not entertain illusions about the ease of his assignment or the reliability of the men he would be dealing with. He arrived in Nassau Harbor in July of 1718 aboard a naval frigate, accompanied by 3 warships and a company of soldiers, carrying his appointment as Royal Governor of the Bahamas and his authority to offer the king's pardon to any pirate willing to accept it. The response was mixed, in ways that Rogers had likely anticipated. Many accepted. Benjamin Hornigold accepted, the man who had, in a real sense, built the Nassau pirate community, and demonstrated the sincerity of his conversion by immediately accepting a commission from Rogers to hunt down those who had not. It was a transaction that said a great deal about the pragmatic calculations that governed life in the pirate world. Hornigold had always been more businessman than ideologue. When the business model changed, he adapted. Charles Vane did not accept. Vane was anchored in Nassau Harbor when Rogers arrived, and his response to the royal governor's appearance was to fire his guns, not in salute, but in defiance, and sailed directly past the naval escort under a black flag, close enough that the men on the warships could see the faces of his crew. It was an act of theatrical contempt that became famous, almost immediately, and that tells you something essential about Vane's character. He was brave to the precise degree that bravery and recklessness are indistinguishable from each other. He made it out. He would not continue to make it out for much longer, and Blackbeard, characteristically, charted his own course between acceptance and defiance. Taking the pardon formally, retreating to the coast of North Carolina where the colonial governor was amenable to arrangements that a stricter administration would not have entertained, and resuming his operations with an informality that suggested he regarded the pardon as a pause rather than a conclusion. He had, at this point, perhaps 5 months to live. The death of Blackbeard, in November of 1718, is one of the most documented events of the Golden Age, which makes it one of the most difficult to see clearly through the accumulated layers of subsequent storytelling. What is established is this: Alexander Spotswood, the governor of Virginia, organized and funded an expedition to find and destroy Blackbeard without waiting for legal authority from London, that he knew would take months to arrive, and might, in any case, not be forthcoming. He sent 2 sloops, the Jane and the Ranger, under the command of a Royal Navy lieutenant named Robert Maynard. The choice of sloops was not sentimental. It was tactical. The waters of Ocracoke Inlet, on the North Carolina coast where Blackbeard had made his base, were shallow and complex. Only shallow-drafted vessels could operate there with any confidence. Maynard found Blackbeard at anchor in Ocracoke on the evening of the 21st of November. The battle the following morning was, by the accounts of those who survived it, genuinely desperate. Blackbeard's crew were experienced fighters aboard a vessel they knew intimately. In water they had spent weeks learning. Maynard's sloops grounded repeatedly in the unfamiliar shallows. The Ranger was effectively taken out of action early in the fighting. The Jane, Maynard's own vessel, closed with Blackbeard's sloop, the Adventure, and the combat became hand-to-hand on the deck in the smoke and noise of a fight that lasted long enough for its participants to understand how closely it could have gone the other way. Blackbeard was killed. The accounts agree on this, and on the further detail, repeated in every subsequent telling with an enthusiasm that reveals more about the teller's needs than about the man himself, that he received 5 musket balls and some 20 sword wounds before he finally fell. Whether this is precise or embellished is impossible now to establish. What is certain is that Maynard cut off his head and hung it from the bowsprit of his sloop for the return voyage to Bath, because in a world of limited communication and widespread skepticism, proof was required. The death of Blackbeard did not end the Golden Age. but it announced, with considerable clarity, that the Golden Age was ending. The years between 1718 and 1725 were years of steady, systematic dismantling. Woodes Rogers drove the remaining pirates from Nassau and set about constructing, with limited resources and considerable personal determination, something that actually resembled a functioning colony. He tried 8 pirates who had rejected the pardon and hanged them on the waterfront in view of the harbor, a deliberate public statement about the changed nature of the jurisdiction they were operating in. He was not a cruel man by the standards of his time, but he was an entirely clear one. The age of informal arrangements was over. Charles Vane was captured in early 1709, tried in Jamaica, and hanged at Gallows Point in Port Royal in March of 1720. His body was hung in a gibbet on Gun Cay, a small island in the harbor entrance, where passing ships could see it for years. Jack Rackham, Calico Jack, as history has called him, for the calico trousers he favored, was taken in October of 1720, his crew drunk and largely insensible below decks when a sloop from Jamaica found them anchored off the coast. The 2 members of his crew who offered any meaningful resistance were both women, Anne Bonny and Mary Read, whose presence aboard a pirate vessel was itself a violation of the articles that most pirate ships maintained, and whose conduct in that final fight was remembered and recorded, while the conduct of most of their male crewmates was not. Rackham was hanged in November. His body, like Vane's, was displayed in a gibbet at a harbor entrance, a piece of deliberate theatre designed to make clear to every sailor passing in and out of Port Royal exactly what the current policy was and what it intended to remain. Bartholomew Roberts met his end on the 10th of February, 1722, off the coast of West Africa. A Royal Navy warship called the Swallow, under Captain Challoner Ogle, had spent months tracking him along the African coast. The end, when it came, was quick by the standards of Golden Age engagements. Roberts was struck by grape shot early in the exchange and was dead before the fighting properly began. His crew, by the accounts, were stunned. The man who had seemed to be everywhere and indestructible had gone between one breath and the next. They struck their colors. More than 200 men were taken prisoner. 52 were eventually tried at Cape Corso Castle on the Gold Coast. 52 were convicted. 52 were hanged in the largest mass execution of pirates in the history of the Atlantic world. With Roberts gone, the Golden Age was effectively over. There were pirates afterward. There have always been pirates, and there are pirates still in other waters with other methods. But the particular configuration of conditions that had produced the Nassau Republic, the sloop fleets, the audacious blockades and the theatrical flags and the democratic articles, and the sense that the margins of the Atlantic world might be organized, however temporarily, on terms that the men who worked those margins had chosen for themselves. That configuration did not reassemble. The navies were larger now and better coordinated. The colonial governments were more serious. The pardons had fractured the community, and the hangings had frightened it, and the years had simply run out for the men who had believed the world was too large and the sea too fast for any institution to catch up with them. They had been wrong in the end, but they had not been wrong for long enough to matter, which is perhaps all that history ever offers to those who set themselves against its direction. The sloop outlasted all of them. It went on being built, being sailed, being refined by the generations of shipwrights who came after, because the qualities that had made it so well suited to piracy were the same qualities that made it well suited to everything else the Caribbean required of a working vessel. Speed, maneuverability, shallow draft, the ability to survive on whatever a beach and a determined crew could provide. These were not pirate virtues, they were maritime virtues. The pirate had simply been the person who understood them most completely and exploited them most ruthlessly for the brief span of years when the conditions were exactly right. The legacy the sloop left to the Golden Age is perhaps best understood not as a legacy of violence, though violence was certainly part of it, but as a legacy of asymmetry, the lesson that a small, fast, intelligently handled vessel, crewed by men with nothing to lose and a thorough knowledge of the local water, could operate effectively against forces of vastly superior nominal power. This lesson was not lost on subsequent generations. It echoes through naval history in ways that are sometimes acknowledged and sometimes not, through the guerre de course tactics of the French Navy, through the commerce raiding of the American Revolution and the War of 1812, through every subsequent conflict in which a weaker maritime power chose speed and knowledge, and the disruption of supply over the impossible ambition of meeting a stronger fleet in open water and winning. The pirates did not invent this logic, but they demonstrated it in the Caribbean in the first quarter of the 18th century, with a consistency and a thoroughness that served as proof of concept for everyone who came after. There is that stretch of water again, between Hispaniola and the Bahamas, in the late afternoon, when the light comes down at an angle that turns the surface of the sea to hammered copper, and the trade wind blows warm and steady from the east. It is quieter now than it was. The sloops are gone, or transformed beyond recognition, into the fiberglass and aluminum vessels that cross the same passages today, carrying tourists and cargo and the ordinary commerce of a connected world. The harbor at Nassau is full of cruise ships so large that they dwarf the entire island infrastructure that surrounds them, and the name of the place where men once voted on their destination and divided their plunder in carefully negotiated shares is now printed on novelty rum bottles and painted on the sides of souvenir shops. History has a sense of humor that does not always land, but the water is the same water. The wind comes from the same direction, and somewhere in the long record of what human beings have done with ships and sea and the extraordinary recurring conviction that freedom might be found somewhere beyond the next horizon, the sloop sits, small and low and fast, making its quiet, unhurried argument for the proposition that the biggest thing in any encounter is not always the one that wins. It never needed many words to make that argument. It only needed the wind and enough room to move.